Thank you very much for that warm introduction and that warm welcome. Program Director and Acting Vice Chancellor, members of the Biko family, Nkosazana and the rest of the family and the foundation, UCT community, management, faculty, students, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. It is indeed a distinct honor for me to deliver the 14th Steve Bantu Biko annual lecture in the year that we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, now African Union. Biko, as we know, is amongst countless heroes and heroines whom we proudly call Pan-Africanists. We here refer to the global Pan-Africanist movement that saw Africans and their descendants in the diaspora unite against slavery, colonialism, racial oppression, and apartheid. And I chose to speak on this topic simply because it is the theme of the African Union for this year. Thus, a movement for freedom, self-determination, equality, and independence emerged and grew, united in action and solidarity. Pan-Africanism became the most comprehensive, ambitious, and enduring philosophy and practice developed and embraced by Africans and people of African descent. Historians trace the evolution of Pan-Africanism back to the need for unity in the struggles against colonialism, slavery, and racial discrimination, or sometimes even further back to the pre-colonial and ancient eras of great African civilizations. This reclaiming of African history forms the foundation for the call for an African Renaissance, a rebirth and rediscovery of Africa's history and cultures. This was necessary, as Biko pointed out, because, I quote, in an effort to destroy completely the structures that had been built up in African society and to impose their imperialism with an unnerving totality, the colonialists were not satisfied with merely holding a people in their grip and empty the native's brain of all form of content. They turned to the past of the oppressed people and distorted, disfigured, and destroyed it. No longer was reference made to African culture, it became barbarism. Africa was the dark continent. Religious practices and customs were referred to as superstition. The history of African society was reduced to tribal battles and internecine wars. There was no conscious migration by the people from one place of abode to another, nor it was always flight from one tyrant who wanted to defeat the tribe, not for any positive reason, but merely to wipe them out of the face of the earth. No wonder the African child learns to hate his heritage in his days at school. A people without a positive history is like a vehicle without an engine. They always live in the shadow of a more successful society, close quote. As we therefore celebrate the 50th anniversary since the founding of the OAU, Africa must continue to rediscover and reflect on her history and tell her own stories. Ladies and gentlemen, long before the partitioning of Africa in Berlin in 18, before the cross-Atlantic slave trade and before colonialism, Africa had its own polity and states. These kingdoms, states and civilizations emerged through political and economic unity and consolidation in order to facilitate trade, wealth creation, and common defense. There is a growing body of historical, archaeological, and anthropological evidence of the great civilizations of Egypt, the Nok and the Ashanti, the empires of the Songhai, Mali, the Moroccan, Pashlikan, the Monomotapa, the royal houses of the Nubia, Joyo, Benin, Congo, Kanebabomi and Dahomey, Abyssinia and Mapungubwe, to mention a few. This body of evidence also highlights the contribution of Africa to human knowledge, to metallurgy, medicine and mathematics, to the creative arts and astronomy, to agriculture and architecture, to gender equality and governance, and a host of other areas of human endeavor. Thus, in 1906, Pixley Kaseme, motivated by the regeneration of Africa, recalled, I quote, "The African is not a proletariat in the world of science and art. She has precious creations of hers or his own, of ivory, copper, and gold, fine-plated willowware, and weapons of superior workmanship," close quote. A body of evidence around the position of African women during this early era of our civilization is also emerging. Scholars and activists have noted the scarcity in accounts of early African civilization and in the evolution of Pan-Africanism of references to women's contribution. As the Caribbean writer Bonita Harris noted, quote, "One has to look wide and deep to find the women. And yet, in Africa's ancient civilization across the continent, women played an important role, with reference to such names as Queen Nzinga of Angola, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba in Ethiopia, Queen Alisa of the Carthaginian Empire, Pharaoh Hatshepsut of Egypt, Nahenda of Zimbabwe, Ya Asentua of the Ashanti Empire, Amina of the Zazzau, Queen Dahia Alkina of Mauritania in Algeria, Mantantisi of the Batlokwa, Buktu of Mali, and of course Timbuktu is named after that woman, Buktu, and many, many other women that held responsibilities in our ancient civilization. In a similar vein, women side by side with their menfolk fought and organized in the anti-slavery, anti-colonial, and national liberation movements in every corner of the continent and the diaspora. Thus, increasingly, the Pan-African struggle also came to mean the struggle for the emancipation from the second-class position women occupied under different forms of expressions of patriarchy. Africa's Renaissance, therefore, draws on the rich diversity of our history, of different regions of the continent expressed in over 1,000 languages, different religions, belief systems, ways of life, and its many, many cultures. This diversity, which forms a key part of the African collective identity, along with the involvement of Africa's people in their own emancipation and reclaiming of African history and indigenous knowledge, are central to African confidence in its renaissance. The unity in diversity of Africa also includes the diaspora, recognizing the impact of the slave trade on the continent's history, the proclamation of the first Black Republic in Haiti in 1804, and the contribution that African descendants and immigrants in the diaspora made towards the Pan-African struggles. Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't remind ourselves about this past, our history will remain told by others. If the stories about us are to be believed, Africans are perpetually in need of being looked after, helped, and rescued from themselves. That's how they tell our story. This single story that keeps being peddled is that Africa is hopeless, violent, downtrodden, disease-ridden, as if it defines who and what we are, a permanent African condition. However, as author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reminds us, this single story creates stereotypes. The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the story. This is why successful generations of Pan-Africanists, and indeed Biko in his generation, stress the importance of the decolonization of the mind as a key component of the struggle for dignity, freedom, and self-determination. The decolonization of the mind starts with our sense of self as Africans, a sense that is developed through our socialization, both in the families, communities, schools, and increasingly in today's information age through the media. We must therefore be deliberate in the teaching and dissemination of African history, the mainstreaming of our indigenous knowledge systems, and the celebration of African culture. This must include telling our story, our history, through film, fashion, literature, cuisine, performing arts, as well as building vibrant science, technology, innovation, and research institutions and cultures. Decolonization of the mind is all this in the often repeated half-truth that Africa is poor. And yet at the time of the formation of the OAU in 1963, several African countries were on par or had even higher GDP rates than the counterparts in Asia. The GDP per capita of Ghana and South Korea were the same in 1960. Until 1975, the world's fastest growing developing country was Gabon. During the 60s and into the 70s, Botswana's growth rate exceeded that of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Malaysia, and Thailand. 30 years ago, China was poorer than Malawi, and yet these countries, often with little natural resources like Singapore and Japan, managed in one generation to rise to prosperity by being resolute, finding their solutions that work for them, and confident in themselves and the durability of their cultures. And without fail, they invested heavily in developing the skills of their people. The 2013 Economic Report for Africa draws attention to Africa's riches, and I quote, "Africa boasts significantly human and natural resources that can be used to promote industrialization and structural economic transformation through value addition strategies in all sectors, agriculture, industry, and services. Though not all African countries are rich in natural commodities, Some, of course, are resource poor, but as well as a growing, predominantly young and urbanizing population, the continent is endowed with many natural resources, including plentiful land, fertile soils, some oil and minerals, and we may add plenty and unexplored maritime resources. Africa is about 12% of the world's oil reserves, 42% of its gold, 80% of chromium and platinum group metals, 60% of arable land in addition to vast timber resources. That's what the report says. Maps of the world often distort the real size of our continent. With a land size of 30,331,532 square kilometers, just under 12 million square miles, Africa can fit in its land mass China, India, the United States of America, Western Europe, and still have space for Japan and a few other countries. Africa is the second largest continent in terms of population size, at over 1 billion people, and we're going to reach 2 billion by 2050. Of course, just over half of our population are women, and young people are over 70% of our total population. Africa is the only continent whose working age population as proportion of the total population is said to grow rather than shrink. By 2025, a quarter of the world's population under 25s will be in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, this begs the question, why have we been unable to turn these resources, potential, and riches into prosperity? There are a number of reasons for this. I will not be able to mention all of them tonight, but I'll mention a few. And we must have an open discussion on the past so that we do not repeat the mistakes. Let me highlight 3 of these. In the first place, Africa has not lacked in grand narratives and visions, or even strategies about the need for its development. The founders of the OAU not only spoke about the liberation from colonialism, but also about the economic emancipation of the continent and the need to build states that play a developmental role. Under the auspices of the OAU, the Monrovia Declaration of 1979 was adopted, which committed African governments to, I quote, promote economic and social development and integration of our economies with a view to achieving an increasing measure of self-sufficiency and self-sustainment. But again, the Lagos Plan of Action in the 1980s set the framework for African economic integration, which guide our integration efforts today and form the foundation of later day NEPAD. In fact, Africa today has policy frameworks in virtually every single aspect of human endeavor. However, amongst the challenges that we face is that often when Africans develop their own frameworks, these are immediately followed by other prescripts developed under stewardship from elsewhere. For an example, the ink on paper of the Lagos Plan of Action was hardly dry when the World Bank issued its BEG report, which, according to Kamis, I quote, was the diametrically opposed to the Lagos Plan and the final act. It located the source of the economic crisis faced by African countries exclusively in domestic policy and political sources, blaming state interventionists and attended distorted markets for the difficulties African countries were experiencing, close quote. The policy prescript arising from this analysis forced African states into structural adjustments that saw the rolling back of the developmental role of the state, especially with regards to agriculture, industrial and social development, cutting down on social expenditure, whilst at the same time having to deal with a heavy external debt burden. Within the structural adjustment framework, African regional cooperation and integration was not a priority for the Bretton Woods institutions, and in fact was regarded as a wasteful and undesirable. The 1980s and its era of structural adjustment program was therefore not only a destructive period for the development agenda for Africa, but also a break on integrative initiatives. Learning from this and countless similar experiences, Africa took charge of its development trajectory and must stay the course to implement it. A second issue is the acknowledgement that neocolonialism continues to play a role on our continent. Given Africa's resources, it is probably understandable that there will always be those who wish to ensure we are under their sphere of influence. In the past, this was done through assassinations, as well as, maybe just to quote one case, Patrice Lumumba in the DRC, and to how the decolonization process in many countries left Africa with little control over their natural resources. The struggle for the economic and political self-determination of the continent therefore remains as important as ever. The third issue relates to the financing of Africa's development. If we have learned anything from the past 50 years, it is that we have to mobilize our own resources to kickstart and speed up our development. We cannot continue to develop grand narratives or policy frameworks and then go around with a begging bowl to get them financed by others. The Lagos Plan of Action did point out that donor money should not be the mainstay of our development. So, and that was 30 years ago, and we still haven't moved, and we can't blame anyone for that. So as we chart the way forward for the next 50 years towards 2063, we must therefore take charge of our own narrative, determine our own development trajectory, and be confident in our abilities as a continent to build an integrated, people-centered Africa, shared prosperity and peace. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa's Oliver Reginald Tambo, in his speech to the OAU Liberation Committee in 1983, at a time when his own country was not yet free, noted, through their heroic efforts, the people of Africa rent asunder the veil of darkness that colonial and imperialism dominated and draped over the continent. Acting as self-confident and conscious makers of their history, as liberators, we, the offsprings of the so-called dark continent, destroyed and buried the entire historic epoch. We who are described as backwards because the midwives of the new social reality of independent people, the reality of the collapse of the colonial system, and confounded those who had thought such a result impossible, undesirable, and even inconceivable. It is these victories that have so transformed the balance of forces in Africa as to render the total liberation of the continent an approaching reality. Thus, as we celebrate 50 years since the founding of the OAU, we acknowledge our debt to the earlier generations who ensured, with the exception of Western Sahara, and a few other islands, that we can also celebrate the liberation of the continent from the shackles of colonialism and apartheid. Ladies and gentlemen, in this, the year of the Golden Jubilee, the mission to become self-confident and conscious makers of history is once again thrust upon all of us. At the start of the 20th century, we boldly proclaimed that the 21st century shall be the African century. Over a decade later, there are encouraging signs that indeed we can change the course of our history. The most important signs are the determination and belief of Africans to take charge of their destiny. Of course, even the economies during this depression in the world, Africa has the 6th fastest growing economies. The African Union Commission recognized that we must look ahead. We cannot celebrate only by looking back, but we must also look into the future, to the next 50 years. We have therefore started the process of interacting so that we can realize what we call Agenda 2063, a vision for the next 50 years that will lead to an Africa that is integrated, prosperous, people-centered, and at peace with itself. The continent-wide discussion on Agenda 2063 are giving form and content to a continent that has awakened and that is ready to take charge of its destiny. Across the continent, and I hope here in UCT as well, countries are developing what they think they would like to see as Africa in 2063. So I hope that we can receive inputs from yourselves as well, either as organizations or individuals. You can send them to a website and give us what you think Africa should look like in 2063. But also tell us what steps do you think need to be taken, and what role will you play in getting us to that Africa. The 50th anniversary summit of the AU in May pledged that by 2020 we shall have silenced the guns on the continent, pledging not to bequeath the burden of conflicts to the next generations of Africans. We also acknowledge that a number of mega trends, such as our youthful and growing population, the empowerment of women, rapid urbanization, coupled with our natural resources and other endowments and technology, provide great possibilities, if harnessed, for us to achieve peace and prosperity within a generation or two. Ladies and gentlemen, as a continent, we are therefore setting our Pan-African development goals as milestones towards the ultimate goal of a continent that is prosperous and peaceful. These include the development of our human capital as our most important and precious resource, through investments in education and skills, science and technology, research and innovation. Africa must have a skills revolution, with large-scale investments in the development and skilling of millions of youth and women. We need artisans, entrepreneurs, project managers, town planners, financiers, civil engineers, and many other skills on a scale never before seen on the continent. We need the skills to take charge of how we use and beneficiate our natural resources, to build and maintain our infrastructure, to drive Africa's industrialization and the development of manufacturing services and a vibrant continental private sector, to deliver quality public service, to eradicate disease, significantly reduce maternal and infant mortality, and provide all citizens across access to health services, to plan our cities as hubs of economic development and rural areas as centers of agriculture and agribusinesses. In addition to investment in the skills of our people, we must also ensure that we have a healthy population with access to health services, to good nutrition, and to other basic services such as shelter, water, and sanitation. A further continental goal is to expand Africa's agricultural production, develop agro-processing and business sectors, increase market access, become a net exporter of food, and attain Africa's collective food security and nutrition through sound environmental and natural resource management, including management the effects of climate change. Despite its vast agricultural potential and water resources, Africa is still a net importer of food and agricultural products. We must therefore ensure that we not only work towards feeding ourselves and eradicating hunger, but also make provision to feed our growing population and the world over the next few decades. The next Pan-African priority is the promotion of inclusive economic development and industrialization through value addition, investments in regional value chains, creating effective public-private partnerships, the effective, transparent, and sustainable utilization of the continent's mineral and other natural resources, and creating conditions for the growth of a vibrant African private sector. Already, 80% of all jobs on the continent are found in the private sector, and Africa is making headway in diversifying its economy away from export and resource-led growth. It has been noted that ICT, especially mobile telephony, is allowing Africa to leapfrog into important stages of development. This is a key trend that may well hold true in a range of other sectors on the continent, including energy. Of course, Africa is called a dark continent for different reasons, but we may still call it a dark continent because of lack of sufficient energy. So we need to ensure that we increase energy generation on the continent. But there are positive signs. Since year 2000, foreign direct investment in Africa has increased from 15.9% of GDP to over 22% in 2012. Though low in comparison with Asia, this trend is expected to continue as an increasing number of regions and economies are able to tap into the international capital markets to help address infrastructure constraints. African businesses are also beginning to take a lead in investing in the continent. Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa ranked amongst the top 10 foreign direct investors into the continent. A key impediment to African growth and integration over the last 5 decades remains our huge infrastructure deficit in transport, energy, ICT, and social services. Our fourth continental priority is therefore the acceleration of infrastructure development, which is critical to industrialization, economic development, and integration, to scaling up intra-African trade and global market access, and intra-African tourism, and also to improve the movement of people and goods across the continent. In this area too, we're taking steps in the right direction. By end of 2012, there were over 800 active infrastructure projects across the continent. The top 10 countries for infrastructure projects up to February 2013 were Algeria, Cameroon, Egypt, Kenya, Libya, Mozambique, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. Important though these initiatives are, they are not enough, and the continent, through its priority infrastructure development agency, PIDA, is looking at ways of multiplying and expanding these efforts over the coming decades. With regards to our fifth Pan-African priority, we say repeatedly that there can be no development without peace and no peace without development and inclusion. Africa is registering increased levels of peace and security. The last 2 decades have been seen substantially reduced reduced number of conflicts, with over 90% of countries at peace for at least the last decade. And whereas in the 1990s, close to 20 countries were engulfed in conflict, this number reduced to only 5 between 20,000 and 2010. In the past 2 decades, the AU policy organs adopted a number of instruments relating to governance, democracy, and human rights, including African peer review mechanism, providing a solid foundation for peace and security by emphasizing political inclusiveness, people-centered and inclusive governance, the management of diversity, and respect for the human rights and the dignity for all. Ladies and gentlemen, women constitute over half of Africa's population and of course give birth to the other half. I've already referred to the fact that we have a youthful population. Mainstreaming the participation of women and the youth in our programs and activities of the Union and the continent is therefore a critical 6th Pan-African priority. In August this year, the AU celebrated a decade since adoption of the AU Gender Protocol as Africa's pledge to women's emancipation and gender equality. A lot of countries are doing well. Like Rwanda is leading the world in the number of women in parliament. We have 2 presidents, we have 1 prime minister in the 54 countries, but we will arrive when we can no longer count. So all I'm saying is that we must do more in terms of women's access to education and skills, land, and participation in the economy. Indications show that not only does the empowerment of women have multiplier social effects on families, communities, and ultimately our nations, but it makes business and economic sense to empower women. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, to implement all these priorities, Africa needs to mobilize massive resources, which is our 7th priority. According to a recent NEPAD and Economic Commission for Africa study on domestic resource mobilization, Africa's resource potential is enormous and strongly confirms that the continent has the means to finance its own development, close quote. The study presents evidence in support of this bold conclusion by looking at various domestic financial instruments such as tax revenues, pension funds, remittances, earnings from minerals and fuels, international reserves, stock exchanges, and bond markets. Some of the immediate initiatives that will be launched soon are the African Development Bank's Africa 50 Private Equity Fund for Infrastructure, the AU Foundation, and the African Remittances Institute. These, we hope, will assist in accelerating the infrastructure development. Ladies and gentlemen, the African continent, through the OAU and now AU, has frameworks and strategies, as I said, in virtually in every area. Now the important thing is the implementation. What is required are practical actions, innovative approaches, and cooperation across government, civil society, and private sector, our intelligentsia, and with African citizenry. We must all take responsibility for making history. Biko said this very eloquently. In order to achieve real action, you must yourself be a living part of Africa and of her thought. you must be an element of that popular energy which is entirely called for the freeing, the progress, and the happiness of Africa. There is no place outside that fight for the artist or for the intellectual who is not him or herself concerned with and completely at one with the people in the great battle of Africa, close quotes. We know that this great battle for a peaceful Africa, integrated, prosperous, people-centered, will not be an easy road. But we should remember the words of Kwame Nkrumah, uttered in 1965. Most of you in this room were not born. I quote, "The task ahead is great indeed, and heavy is the responsibility. And yet it is a noble and glorious challenge. It is a challenge which calls for courage to dream, the courage to believe, the courage to dare, the courage to do, the courage to envision, the courage to fight, the courage to work, the courage to achieve the highest excellencies and the fullest greatness of humanity. Dare we ask for more in life," close quote. But I would like to conclude with a quote from your last year's memorial lecture presenter, Ben Okri. He's one of my favorite writers. I quote, and this comes from his book, Ways of Being Free. "They tell me that nature is the survival of the fittest. And yet, look at how wondrous gold and yellow fishes prosper amongst the silent stones of the ocean beds, while sharks continuously prowl the waters in their impossible dreams of oceanic domination, and while whales become extinct. How many butterflies and iguanas thrive, while elephants turn into endangered species, and while even lions growl in their dwindling solitude. There is no such thing as a powerless people. There are only those who have not seen and have not used their power and will. It would seem a miraculous feat, but it is possible for the undervalued to help create a beautiful new era in human history. New vision should come from those who suffer most and who love life the most. It is only by establishing a common destiny and outlook that we can overcome and prosper. In these words of Ben Okri, Africa must realize that there is no such thing as a powerless continent, and we must, and all of us have to work towards a prosperous Africa at peace with itself by 2063 or before. I thank you.